This evening, we continue with the question of Catholic social teaching around the question of rights and responsibilities. Historically, Catholic theology has spent much more energy and effort in the first 1900 years on the question of responsibilities. Because again, the earliest sources, the patristics, and especially the medievals, the scholastics, stressed the responsibilities that we have upward toward the Christian state. They did not stress personal rights at all. It is the responsibilities towards the Christian state. Early on, particularly with Constantine's conversion to Christianity and the slow morphing of the Roman Empire into a Christian state, responsibilities toward the state began to be seen as responsibilities towards God. Now, Constantine, when he called the Council of Nicaea, one of his contemporary biographers, frankly, kind of like the court hagiographer, referred to Constantine in the Greek as is apostolos. So he is equal to the rest of the apostles. That is, he is a universal bishop. So the idea was that God had so ordered all of creation, God had so ordered the entire political system, God had so ordered all of these things, that for us to live correctly, frankly, all we needed to do was be responsible to what we were called to do. And this responsibility always went upward. This got a particular focus in the Middle Ages under the socioeconomic system that is known as feudalism. Feudalism is ultimately a question where each person has responsibilities to the person above them. So the serf has to provide so much labor and or produce to his lord. And that lord has to provide so much produce, cash, or military service to his lord. And that lord has to do it to his lord, and that lord has to do it to the king, and the king has to do it to the emperor, and the emperor has to do it to the pope, and the pope has to do it to God. It is a perfectly ordered, hierarchical universe. After the Council of Trent, this gets even more stressed in what is called the union of throne and altar, the Christian state, in which the king is recognized as king Dei gratia rex, king by the grace of God. And if you watched The Crown and you watched the scenes, that stuff is still deeply imbued in coronation rituals. I'm not quite sure whether Elizabeth actually believed that. I'm even less sure that Charles believes it. But still, it's part of the ritual that the king was Dei gratia rex. Therefore, the king understood that part of his duty was to promote the Christian religion in his kingdom. And it's not for nothing that the traditional titles in European royalty bespeak this. The official title of the King of France was the most Christian King of France. The official title of the King of Spain was the most Catholic King of Spain. And the official title of the King of Portugal was the most faithful King of Portugal. Elizabeth II still has the official title granted to her by the popes, not to her, but to her predecessors by the popes, as defender of the faith. So the kings then viewed part of their job was to promote Christian order and promote Christian responsibility. To the church was granted exclusive monopolies over education, social services, healthcare. And in this perfectly Christian system, the church supported the authority of the kings, and the kings supported the authority of the church, which explains precisely why in the Middle Ages, when the peasants rose up, they put a pitchfork through the local lord and their local pastor, because both were symbols of an ordered by God that they viewed as simply oppressing. Okay? So it's all about responsibility. Now, if it's all about responsibility, there's a corollary to this. Error has no rights. A teaching that the church, for the most part, lived straight through until 1965, and that was officially repudiated, 1965. Those who professed a faith that was in error, read in a Catholic state, Protestants, Jews, Muslims. They had no rights to their religion. They had no civil rights whatsoever. Now, should the most Catholic king of Spain, in his mercy and benevolence, grant this to his Jews, or to his Muslims, or to his Protestants, he could grant it because he was so charitable and kind and nice. And his successor, who could be a lot more, shall we say, sphincter-tight controller, could simply come in and wipe it out completely. Again, keep in mind that this went for the Pope of Rome as the king of central Italy. Do not forget, I hardly recommend you watch Stanley Tucci's A Taste of Italy on CNN's on 9 o'clock on Sunday nights. This past week, they had Rome. And gastronomically, they went to visit Rome's ghetto. Rome had a ghetto in which its Jewish residents were forced to be locked in every evening at sunset, and the gates were not opened up until dawn the next morning. And the Jews of that neighborhood, the ghetto, were forced several times a year to come to the local Catholic parish and hear forced conversion sermons. That local parish is called Our Lady of the Cries. And it's Our Lady of the Cries of Rachel mourning her dead children who are no more. Error has no rights. A commonly understood, a commonly practiced pattern. It's all about the responsibilities that each one of us has towards a God who created the universe in perfect order and majesty and simplicity, in which everything goes upward and not a lot comes downward. Now, this slowly begins to change, frankly, only in the 19th century. But it accelerates much more and is firmly codified by the Church in the Second Vatican Council. And it's firmly codified in the Church in the Second Vatican Council, first in the document of non-Christian religions, nostre aetate, in our age, which is often mostly has to do with Judaism. And the second, it has to do with on human dignity, Dignitatis Humanae. They're both documents of the Second Vatican Council. Now, a little before, during, and after the council, Christianity, Catholicism, began to note that there were states that were not particularly conducive to human rights. Again, let's just particularly look at the 1930s and the big three that we're talking about: the Soviet Union, Nazi Germany, and fascist Italy. All three of whom trampled upon individual human rights in different kinds of ways. And the church began to seriously look at this and say, now wait a minute. If what we're saying about human dignity, if the very first foundational basis of Catholic social teaching, which is the one we did way back at the beginning, the very first one, if that is the basis upon which all things come, then the natural corollary of this is if every human being has dignity, therefore every human being has rights that are human, that prescind from what he or she believes. I may have used this example before, but I'll use it again because it exemplifies this older mentality. In the 1840s, there was a Jewish family in the city of Bologna, Italy, which was under the Papal States. This Jewish family was fairly well-to-do and had Christian housemaids, Catholic Italian housemaids. A little boy, a 4-year-old boy, developed a fever, and his family was deathly afraid that he was dying. One of the Catholic maids did what her parish priest taught her regularly to do. That is, baptize pagan babies when you can. So she snuck into the bedroom, baptized little Edgar, so little Edgar would go to heaven when he died, and not to that place where bad Jews go. Edgar lived. The maid goes to her parish priest and reports this. The parish priest goes to the Archbishop of Bologna. The Archbishop of Bologna writes to the Pope. The Pope sends papal gendarmes to break into the Mortara household, kidnap little Edgar, take him away from his family so that he could be raised as a good Catholic. Why? The sacramental responsibility to raise children in the faith trumped the non-existent human rights of the Mortara family to raise their own child. True story. It's in the process of being made into a film. Supposedly it was going to be directed by Steven Spielberg, but I just read that he pulled out of the project. So I doubt whether it'll get much international acclaim without Spielberg. In any case, the church began to shift from that mentality slowly. There's a great impetus, frankly, that comes from the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights of 1948. This is one of the places where the church learns from secular government. The Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And church teaching begins to be exemplified in this way. Human rights flow naturally from human dignity and are rationally perceptible by all people. They're part of natural law. There is a natural law perceptible by all people that do not have to be believing Christians about what we talk about human rights and human dignity. This stuff cannot be granted by human authority. Conversely, it cannot be taken away by human authority. This is inherent to what it means to be human as understood by Catholic teaching. This is universal. So here, this is an implicit critique of racial slavery. It is inviolable. A critique that error has no rights. And it is inalienable, which means even if I don't want it, I can't give it away. I can't sell myself into slavery in order to get Newman out of debt. I can't do that. Now, John Paul II, in his encyclical Centesimus Annus, again, remember how these Catholic social encyclicals work. Centesimus Annus is the 100th anniversary of Rerum Novarum, 1891, so early 90s. In this particular case, it was delayed by a year because John Paul was shot. He lists 6 inalienable human rights. First is the right to live. Everything flows from this preeminent right. If you recall back to the discussions prior to the November election, the American bishops, in their letter to the preamble to faithful citizenship, quote this particular point, that all other human rights flow from this. And if this is taken away, it vitiates all of them. Secondly, the right to live in a united family. That is, those government systems, such as Pol Pot's Cambodia, that took children away from their families in order to be re-educated in camps according to Pol Pot's philosophy, is wrong. And in a moral environment conducive to the growth of the child's personality. There can be other ways to raise children, such as daycare, such as public education, such as orphanages, but all of these should create some sort of an environment that is conducive to the growth of a child's personality and morality. Third, the right to develop one's intelligence and freedom. The right to an education. It is immoral to suggest that people of a certain race or people of a certain class or people of a certain background should not be educated. Remember, this is part of the Nazi subjugation of Slavic peoples. After exterminating the Jews, the next point was to take the Poles and the Russians and the Ukrainians and the Czechs, systematically eliminate the university professors and the leaders, and then just feed everyone else enough to be able to work. No education, no learning, not even learning how to read and write, which, by the way, was also the pattern of American slaveholders in the South. The exact same thing. We are educated and taught freedom in order to seek and know the truth. So seeking, trying to understand, all of these things are an inalienable part of learning. Any kind of an environment that tells you to sit down, shut up, be quiet, and listen to me is violating, in a sense, your human rights to free expression and to freely seek. Fourth, the right to share in the work, which makes wise use of the earth's material resources. So, work in which we express our co-creation with God is a human right. If you remember last time when we talked about the just connection of society, we said that the principal job of governments is to expand economies such that all those who want meaningful work might have it. Again, this is the universal corollary of this. And to derive from that work the means to support oneself and one's dependents. To support oneself and one's dependents does not mean merely the federal minimum wage. The Church in the United States for over 100 years has been talking about a living family wage, which also includes things like enough for retirement, insurance in case of difficulty, and from a Catholic perspective, the right to health care, which in Catholic teaching is not a perquisite of your job, but it is a right that is connected to your human dignity. Fifth, the right freely to establish a family, to have and to rear children through the responsible exercise of one's sexuality. Here, programs such as mainland China's two-child policy are immoral. Incidentally, the two-child policy in a Chinese culture that values male children over female children had the unintended consequence of the abortion of millions of females, and consequently, millions of young Chinese males who cannot find a mate because there are no young women. See what happens when we tinker with things that are against the question of human rights. And to rear children through the responsible exercise of one's sexuality. Here, of course, the Church would always underline the responsible exercise. Finally, the right to religious freedom, understood as the right to live in the truth of one's faith and in conformity with one's transcendent dignity as a person. From the Church's point of view, this is the synthesis of all the other stuff. 1 is the right to life, and 6 encapsulates that in the right to worship freely. And all of them are all connected together. Rights presuppose responsibilities. And here I quote from the Social Catechism of the Church. Those who claim their own rights, yet altogether forget or neglect to carry out their respective duties, are people who build with one hand and destroy with the other. Essentially, the Church does not, in her social doctrine, lay out what individual responsibilities are. But individual responsibilities can all be summarized into a responsibility to promote, foster, and cultivate the common good. And this is always the corollary to an exaggerated individualism that comes from, well, this is about my own individual rights. Notice what we said earlier. This was very clear already in the Church's teaching on property. That an individual has the right to property, but that right to property is not absolute when my brother is starving. I do not have a moral right to 2 sandwiches because my daddy is rich when the person next to me is starving to death. Rights presuppose, individual human rights always presuppose this wider question of responsibility towards the common good. Here, what is true for human individuals is true as well for human communities. Whole human communities have these same rights writ large. There is in Catholic teaching the necessity to close the gap between the letter and the spirit of human rights. The more fortunate, and this is a near quote from the Catechism, the more fortunate are to renounce some of their rights so as to place their goods more generously at the service of others. So, for example, stating that a low capital gains tax or any other form of taxation that benefits people who have amassed wealth is my human right to have that. The church says, no, the wealthy and the powerful might need to sacrifice some of their own stuff for the common good of those who have less. And here, an excessive affirmation of equality can give rise to an individualism in which each one claims his own rights without wishing to be answerable for the common good. Read much of our political system precisely in these last 2 sentences. There's a great battle in our political system precisely around these last 2 phrases. Now, what's the role of the church in all of this? And this I'll close. First role of the church is to proclaim these human rights. To proclaim this forthrightly. This is where we stand. Secondly, it is to denounce those places and those initiatives and those situations that violate it. So the church has both its magisterial role of proclaiming this and its prophetic role of pointing out where there are problems. Let me stop there if there's any questions or comments before you break into group. Thy name is Constantine. The Constantinian Revolution in the 320s, which first legalized Christianity, then slowly began to foster and favor its growth, until 70 years later, Christianity becomes the state religion of the Roman Empire, is a paradigm shift that cannot be overestimated. It cannot be overestimated. Now, the critique of that is going to be precisely the critique implicit in yours, that we would do better to be smaller, more faithful, Christian community, stressing equality, pre-Constantinian, frankly, before we went to bed with political power. The defense of that is, somehow this happened, and somehow this must have been a part of God's plan, and because of this, Christianity has been able to spread throughout the entire globe. So there's some good that comes of it. But there is a real tension point precisely in where you articulated that. There just is. And there are certain Christian groups, typically the Quakers, the Mennonites, and the Anabaptist tradition, that would prefer to go back to a pre-Constantinian time. Much like, for example, there are reform groups within Christianity and Catholicism, most notably in the United States, Dorothy Day and the Catholic Workers, that by definition have a huge critique with us giving too much obedience to what Peter Morin called Holy Mother of the State. Okay? So, but it's the Constantinian Revolution. You can't overestimate that. But interestingly, historically speaking, subsidiarity only dates in Roman Catholic theology until 1927. Coincidentally, after communism and fascism had already taken root. And then people started to say, oops, maybe giving the church, again, maybe giving the state too much power is not a wise idea. The latest development of this same thing is Francis's last change of the catechism that makes state use of capital punishment practically impossible. Because it is now this deep distrust of states that trample individual human rights too easily.